I noticed a strange rattling, knocking sound from this 280 SL the other day, and I think I've tracked it down to the drive shaft here. There shouldn't be that amount of movement, so we're gonna whip the wheel off and have a quick look. I've loosened the nuts off first, and we're gonna jack the car up here initially and then put an axle stand under here. Just put a little piece of wood under there to avoid scratching the paint off the rear subframe mount. Although the handbrake is on, we're just going to chock both front wheels to avoid the car rolling. Unless you're very confident about your jacking points, I wouldn't recommend using them to jack the car up. They're often very, very rusty. So we've just cut a groove out of that wood, and we're going to use an axle stand here to support the car. Use an additional bit of wood here just to spread the load. You should be able to just let that off now. You can see when I move the axle in and out that there is moving in and out, which it shouldn't. Now that nut is incredibly tight. It feels like the whole bolt wants to shear off if I try and undo it. I think what we're going to do is just whip the caliper off, take the brake disc off, and see if we can get a better look at that. Just using a breaker bar to break those two nuts, and then a standard socket. The other thing I've just noticed is that that pin is coming out of there. Bolts should have blue thread lock on them, so they can be pretty difficult to get out. Tap that pin back in. We don't want any unforeseen tragedies, and these should just come off now. We'll just hang the calipers up here, and this being a new disc should come right off. Sometimes you need to bash it with a rubber hammer. If you ever need to take the brake disc off, don't forget, in order to do so, you're going to have to release the handbrake, otherwise you'll never get it off. I think I know what the issue is. Now, the axle shafts, which are these things here, are attached to the hub with a long bolt and a spacer tube like that, and then this special one-time use washer. And what happens when you torque up this bolt to the specified torque, this washer will kind of not crush, but it'll be under compression, and it will stop this bolt coming undone. Now take a look at this. This here is one of the spacer tubes that came with the new axle shafts. It just so happens that I have the old spacer tubes, one of which I used to make that tool to do the rear torsion springs in the red project car. But look at this. They are different lengths. And it transpires, if you look at the Mercedes catalogue, or the Mercedes sort of parts thing on MB Tyler, that there are indeed two different lengths of spacer tubes. This is a picture of the 280 SL, and part number 152 is that spacer. So if we scroll down to 152, we will see that there's actually two part numbers. They're both exactly the same, but you'll see one is 72 and one is 67 millimeters. There's a 5mm difference. I think we had a 72 in there and we should have had a 62mm. And what is happening is this is just the wrong length spacer tube for that car. So if I put in the old spacer tube, that should pull the axle shaft tight to the hub and stop that rattle. So let's try that and see how we go. I have actually ordered one of these from Mercedes, but it hasn't arrived yet after almost a week, so I'm going to put this one on. But before I put it in on, so I am going to clean up all of that rust just with a wire wheel, and then put some oil on there to stop it rusting in the future. Just clean that up. You can put some rust encapsulator on there, but we're just going to cover that with a coating of oil. Anybody who watches this channel regularly will or might remember that when we fitted those axle shafts, we actually ended up snapping off one of these bolts in the axle shaft and had to drill it out. And I think that is because we were trying to tighten up against this as opposed to this actually crushing on down. So I suspect that when I take the other wheel off, I may also find exactly the same problem, because obviously I have both of the old spacers here, and I imagine that what I've done on the other wheel is also put in a long tube, but that problem has not manifested itself yet. In fact, that problem only manifested itself when I drove down the motorway at high speed the other day to drop my daughter off somewhere, and I noticed when I got to my destination I heard that rattling for the first time. So just to let you know, if you do ever change your axle shafts, just make sure that you've got the right spacer. So we just put the bolt back in with the shorter spacer. We've torqued it up to 30 Newton meters. I'm not 100% sure of the torque, but that's pretty thin bolt. And I think the spec for bolts that thickness is about 28 to 30 Newton meters, but we can always come back and tighten it up at a later date. And there is now, although there's movement in the axle shaft, there is no movement in the actual shaft and the hub, which is what you'd expect. So let's take this car for a test drive and see if that sorted the problem. With the benefit of hindsight, we didn't need to take the calipers off. We're just going to whiz those back on. The torque spec on those bolts, I think it's 120 Newton meters. I will double check it, but they will need blue thread lock on. A dab of this on the threads. Now, I did actually forget to put Loctite on the threads on one of the front calipers, and we did actually lose one of these bolts recently. So just a reminder, caliper bolts, blue thread lock. We'll whiz these bolts on finger tight while the car's still up in the air. You can actually just use the impact wrench as well, just to save a bit of time. But these bolts need to be torqued up to 100, some people say 120, but we'll be using a torque wrench and breaker bar to do that. When you tighten them up, crisscross pattern. Got this car back together, just need to see if it starts after all this time. I say after all this time, it's been about a week. These cars are normally pretty good at starting. I'm just going to take it for a little test drive and see if that rattle has gone. Unfortunately, that sound, I don't know if you'll be able to pick it up on this camera, that clunking sound has not gone. Leave the video here. Unfortunately, we sorted one problem that we didn't know we had, but we've still got the major problem of a knocking sound coming from the car. Now, it happens whether you're in gear or not in gear, but it only happens when you're moving, and it kind of feels like it's coming from the clutch gearbox part of the car. It's like someone tapping on the chassis with a hammer. If anyone's got any ideas of where to look, I'm a bit pushed for ramp space at the moment, but if anyone's got any ideas, do drop me a comment.